Thanks for inviting me to contribute to this. I have been looking at North-South negotiations for a long while and have sort of stolen from the deliberation literatures, because in IR that's not really what we do power. And so it's nice to sort of connect back and be able to get your feedback on this. I have long believed that you could never possibly have those ideal type deliberations in at the international sphere. So generally what IR scholars then do is say, well, let's not worry about them then, and let's just talk about power. But I've been trying to say that even international negotiations at some levels have a deliberative element to them, so we should try to see how they approximate conditions of deliberation rather than just saying, well, we don't have the ideal form, so we'll never get there. And there are a few scholars whose work I build on, Thomas Riese and others, who have been talking about that at the international level. Another thing I could tell you by way of my ontology, and this is slightly anecdotal, but since we've all had lunch, and just in case you're falling asleep, I hope this is somewhat interesting. I worked on this book called Negotiation in the Global Information Economy, and I think I had one of these very die-hard classical Marxist referees, and I haven't been able to figure out who she is or who he is, but I'll keep taxing my brain for this. The language was very European, so that already puts it outside the American public sphere of political science. And so anyway, this person said, well, Singh has really not grappled with Luke's third phase of power. I had talked about the fact that I'm not talking about it. Here's a little anecdote. I'd taken Jim Scott's epigraph at the beginning of one of his books about the Ethiopian peasant bowing in front of the landlord but farting in the margins. And he'd said, I had not really talked about the third phase of power, where the peasant does not exercise any movement in the bowels. And I really hadn't. But this referee made it seem that that was the only possibility I hadn't considered. So I wanted to bring them back to the possibility I was considering, which is not about the lack of the movement in the bowels, but a plenitude of movement in the bowels, where they're sitting right in the middle of the street. They're not even standing on the margin, because at some level, the optimist in me is beginning to see these sort of deliberative places where the G2 is no longer a G2, it's a G20, and the G20 perhaps will grow even more, or where there are linkages that we hadn't seen before, where power structures are being threatened, where new understandings are arising. So that by way of the kind of the ontological space in which I've been working, which is not to say that I'm ignorant of where those things don't get toppled, but it depends on, so if you're an American IR person, you're looking at structure and you're replicating the structure, my reflexivity comes from, wanting to find agency in this and trying to see where are the spaces of this agency, and perhaps the twain shall meet somewhere along the way. In this particular paper, I wanted to do a kind of a comparative analysis of two global institutions. We often talk about how there may be a democratic deficit when it comes to global institutions. These spaces are not very deliberative. So I wanted to do, and Biju sort of encouraged me, because I'd been working on WTO and UNESCO, and I've just in passing, I mentioned to him that, the WTO might actually be more deliberative. And he says, why don't you write on that? And then I thought I'll get hammered to pieces for writing that. So I wait for that. But what I wanted to see was, if we are talking about a crisis of legitimacy for global governance, and legitimacy in this case, there are various definitions of legitimacy, but at the most basic level, it will be people taking ownership of the deliberation process. Where is that ownership, and who takes ownership? Who is involved in carving out that sort of ownership? And so that's what I wanted to do in terms of global institutions. And another very practical interest was that in as much as global actors now have an opportunity to what we call venue shop, they can go to a variety of fora to get what they want, which places might be more deliberative than others. Quite counterintuitively, then we begin in the trade media and a lot of other accounts, WTO is not the place to try to find deliberative legitimacy. WTO is not the place which would have transparency, accountability. WTO is not the place where you want to go venue shop too often, because that's where you meet structural power, and it's supposed to dictate outcomes. UNESCO, on the other hand, is this wonderful deliberative body we often hear, which looks after some of the humanity's noblest ideals. The preamble that every person should memorize begins with how, and this was a preamble that the U.S. Librarian of Congress Archibald MacLeish paraphrased from a Clement Attlee statement that since wars begin in the minds of men, it's in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be created. And it's worth memorizing. It's very noble. And so UNESCO then appears as this body which would look after ideals like this and would involve the humanity, because how can you have a culture of peace without involving the objects of that culture at some level? So UNESCO seems that, but this paper sort of concludes that it may actually be the opposite. And the reason I hypothesize that it might be the opposite is by looking at first what I call the issue structure. What is the issue being negotiated? What are the resources being directed towards that issue? Who gets mobilized within the institution and outside the institution? And then from that context of the issue, I go to the deliberative context to think of who was included and who was excluded in those deliberations. Was there actual persuasion that took place, or was it just a sort of a monologue, somebody delivering it from the heights of power and say, do this, do that? In WTO, we know those stories where they came with a negotiating text and said, following other places where you must sign, and now you're part of a global trade agreement. So it is one of those take it and leave it scenarios. That's a kind of a monologue and not terribly deliberative or persuasion oriented, and that is more coercive. So I hypothesize that if you have if you have a scenario in which you have streamlined or focused interests around issue structures, these processes are likely to be far more participatory than those featuring divided interests and really weak institutions with fewer resources. Now, in terms of bringing in international relations theorizing into this picture, I would like to build upon the work which is now beginning to take international institutions themselves seriously. We've taken power so seriously in international relations that we really haven't paid much attention to what happens within the corridors of power or what happens within particular types of institutions. So most of international relations regime theory is about actors' expectations converging. So actors have interests, they're predefined, and then we somehow find out that as a result of those interests, some convergence takes place. And when we're bothered about how that convergence comes about, then perhaps in the margins, not usually, and it's sort of the margins of our empirical research sometimes, and not even in the theoretical part of it, that we say some kind of bargaining might have taken place over here, and it's usually some kind of strategic conduct that is attributed to those bargaining processes. I come out of the negotiation tradition, so where we started to, the negotiation scholars started to look at this was where it wasn't actually happening in the margins, where it might have been happening a little more in the mainstream, and where you didn't have to take interests as constant. They might have actually arisen as a result of the negotiation itself. But still, by and large, it was mostly to see how interests converged. And we didn't really look within the institutions to see what happened within, how did a particular agenda arise from there. And that's where a lot of the constructivist school in international relations comes in. Marty Finnemore quite persuasively argued that it was in UNESCO that a science agenda began to develop, and even though the developing countries had no particular interest in having science ministries as they came into the post-colonial scene, but they were quite convinced by or persuaded by the UNESCO officials to start thinking in terms of science. It might have resonated with them because they were trying to be, at that time, they're buying into the modernization ideal, or they were thinking of science as progress. So at that broader level, it might have resonated, but at a more specific level, they put in science ministries because UNESCO came up with this. But again, it doesn't quite tell us why is it that UNESCO was able to do that and wasn't able to bring a culture of peace, which is in the preamble, or why it wasn't to do 100 other things. So there's some but it's instructive in terms of the organization itself playing some kind of a role that we need to look within UNESCO. Who went from UNESCO to Jordan and talked to who to get this agenda translated? And I kind of build on that kind of somewhat the latest iteration of the Marty Finnemore type of research. They took up a project called Global Governors, in which they're actually looking at institutions and how institutions set agendas, and then who are the people who get involved in terms of those agendas. And there's also, as I think, a new institutionalist tradition, I would call it, at the international level, the Global Governance Journal or Routledge series in international literature which are looking within institutions to see how do they allocate their resources, what happens to those resources. So I build on that literature, and then I try to bring in part of the deliberation theory to see what type of persuasion takes place, what type of problem solving. To me, an ultimate example of deliberation is where some problem solving took place as opposed to somebody's interest just being dictated all the way through. So, having given that sort of brief introduction to where IR theory perhaps tries to come into this, let me just give a brief empirical overview. I do it in two parts. One, I give a broad overview of UNESCO and WTO, and then I look at a particular, I was looking for one particular issue which might have overlapped in both organizations to try to see how was it deliberated in WTO versus UNESCO. So first, the story of overall UNESCO and WTO. In UNESCO, as I said, the broad agenda is that cultural peace agenda. It came from the fact that in 1942, the Conference for Allied Ministers in Education began to think about the fact that if we were going to have a post-war global order, then we needed to think very hard about the kind of science, the kind of education, the kind of propaganda which produced the Nazi regime, which then resulted in war. And so from the Conference of Allied Ministers, you finally get in 1945, the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization is very much rooted in scientific humanism. By the way, a little contradiction there. Michael Woolcock had the eugenist at the bottom of the barrel there in your curve. Julian Huxley was the first Secretary General of UNESCO, and he was a eugenist. And on the other hand, he's also a scientific humanist. And he's the one who starts some of the few of the first programs that came out of UNESCO, which dealt with race issues. So most of the people, like when Claude Lévi-Strauss and all did their foundational studies on race, they were done because UNESCO asked them to do so. So the strange contradictions there were just as a side comment. But this is the preamble. This is what gives UNESCO its agenda. And then I recently was in UNESCO, and one of the people said, how prescient that if you could just get people to think about these issues in 5 sectors, they wouldn't fight with each other. And those 5 sectors were education, social and human sciences, natural sciences, communication, and culture.